Ready to go?
Okay.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Lloyd Goading. I'm a member of the New Mexico Solar Energy Association, and I'm here to get some reactions, I guess, from what your take was on the debate that went on earlier.
Right. So I guess just for those of you who might be coming into the live stream just now, my name is Doug Howe. I'm a former commissioner from the PRC, the Public Regulation Commission, and I had the opportunity to participate in this morning's public policy debate, which included myself, Randy Sadowik, who's the president and co-owner of Positive Energy, and Gerard Ortiz, who is the vice president of regulatory policy at PNM. So you asked, I think, what my perceptions were of the public policy debate. And I'd be interested in getting your perceptions first. So why don't we start there?
Well, first of all, I was sorely disappointed that people from the current Public Regulatory Commission and politicians as well were absent. It seems to me that from some of the comments you made, that's where the action really needs to take place, is at a political level. Am I understanding what you presented correctly?
That's true. I mean, you know, when we're talking about what the challenges and the benefits are of both energy efficiency and renewable energy, these things have been codified in the law. So there's the Efficient Use of Energy Act, which was enacted by the state legislature, and there's the Renewable Energy Act. The PRC, the Public Regulation Commission, has some flexibility with those laws. The laws were crafted in a way that the PRC can create rules and have some flexibility with some of them. But a lot of those laws are what we call hardwired. They have hard and fast rules in them about how much and how often and how fast things can occur. So a good example is the Renewable Energy Act. The Renewable Energy Act is the law which establishes that New Mexico investor-owned utilities should supply 20% of their power with renewable energy by 2020. That's hardwired there. The PRC can't change that number to anything lower than 20%.
Or anything higher?
Well, you know, that's actually an issue of debate.
Really?
Because the law doesn't prevent you, at least in theory, from surpassing the law. It says, here's the standard, here's what we want, here's what the law requires the utilities to do. If the utilities decided they wanted to go past that, well, then they would still be compliant with the law. The law does not say you will not go over that issue at that point.
But it would have to come of their own volition.
It would have to come, and there's the rib. It would have to come of their own volition, and that got us into a discussion about how a rate case actually works. And when PNM and the other utilities file their applications for renewable energy or energy efficiency, which they have to do every year at the PRC, this is a 6-month-long process that's roughly akin to torture. And
I believe that.
The contention, and Gerard Ortiz, the vice president of PNM, I think put this very well. He said he's never anxious to file a new application because it is so contentious. It's so filled with lawyers. The rooms are filled with lawyers. It's so rife with potential litigation that it's very, very difficult to get it all done in 6 months. And in fact of matter, if PNM or Southwestern Public Service or El Paso Electric, the 3 investor-owned utilities that are in the state of New Mexico, if they went to the PRC and said, you know, we're going to comply with the law, but we want to go past the law. We're going to give you an application for, you know, 25% or 30% renewable. They would figuratively get murdered at the PRC, because half of the lawyers in those rooms are representing interests that don't really agree with the renewable energy law. They don't agree with the energy efficiency law.
And the reality of it at the present time is that quite the contrary from going beyond that. I just thought that might be an interesting
Right.
point to look at. But there's a widespread belief that they're dragging their feet in meeting those things. What's your take on that?
Some are dragging their feet, others are not. Okay, P&M says they are, and the data supports it, that they are on a track to meet the 20% renewable energy requirement by 2020. Now, this gets a little bit complicated, but one of the finer points, but it's very important in the renewable energy law, is this thing called the RCT, the reasonable cost threshold.
Okay.
And what the law really says is that these utilities need to meet 20% of their power with renewable energy by 2020, but it's subject to a cap on costs called the reasonable cost threshold.
And as Randy pointed out, the true costs, the costs of coal, the environmental costs, are never even part of the formula.
They're not. They are not included in there. So the reasonable cost threshold, the RCT, is currently set at 3% of the investor-owned utilities' total revenue requirement. So P&M can spend up to 3% to meet its goals.
I see.
And it's able to do that, and it believes that it will be able to get to 2020 with 20% at 3%. El Paso Electric says they can't do it. All right, so
That's
they say
quite
they
interesting
can't get there.
because PV in the El Paso Electric service area should help them with their peaking problems, with all kinds of things that you would think would make that more feasible.
You would think, okay? And this is where, you know, the rules and the laws start to get in the way of these things. So recently, it's now taken 16 months. The PRC went through 4 iterations of trying to change the renewable energy rules. And what was really at stake there was what costs should be included in this 3% cap and what benefits should be included in the 3% cap. Because as you pointed out, in New Mexico, the solar PV, solar anything, whether it's PV or any other type of solar, helps the utilities to meet their peak demand. Okay, so the hottest time of the day is usually between 4 and 8 in summer, and that's when PV is going to peak, and it's also when the electric utilities grid peaks.
Right.
So you would think you've got a happy convergence of interests here.
Exactly.
And if they can help them meet that peak, then you ought to be able to say, well, that's going to offset the need for more generating capacity down the road. So we won't have to build as much in a few years to meet that peak, which is actually growing every year.
And so is that where Randy was getting at when he said that trying to meet the 20% was really short-sighted because we really need to be planning this out to 100%?
Well, I would put a little bit of a different spin on what Randy was saying there. Randy made the point that 20% is a fine goal, but you know, our goal really ought to be 100%. There are a lot of technical reasons why 100% is not really practical between now and 2020. So I think my view of what Randy said was that we ought to be setting this kind of long-range aspirational goal. Okay, and maybe it's a 2050 goal to meet 100% and start working back from there, rather than setting these kind of arbitrary goals of 20%. I mean, what's magical about 20%?
Right. Except that it matches 2020.
It matches 2020, and they could get it through the legislature. You know,
Right, yeah.
it's the number that worked. But there's no technical reason we're limited at 20.
The other thing that always comes to mind to people in renewable energy is the advantage of energy efficiency. We hear it over and over again that that's the cheapest generating capacity, if you want to call it that. Why does the utility, why does the Public Regulatory Commission, why does the legislature resist energy efficiency?
Well, there's a lot of pieces to that, to that question. I would say, let me just address the PRC piece of the thing, because I can speak from firsthand knowledge there. The PRC is kind of a complicated organization. It consists of 5 commissioners who have to vote on things like an energy efficiency plan or
And
renewable
who themselves
energy.
are elected.
And who themselves are elected. So when you vote, that means you have to get 3 votes for anything to go through. 3 votes can be hard to get at the PRC for anything, because it depends upon the commissioners being able to work together to come to some sort of consensus. And that has frequently been a very difficult task to achieve, is that kind of consensus. So you've got the commissioner issue on the one side. On the other side, though, you have the staff of the PRC, which consists of not only of lawyers, but it consists of engineers and economists who really do understand these issues. And you know, I can assure you that there are people on the staff, there are engineers and economists on the staff who understand energy efficiency and are quite passionate about it. And they will, their job is to ensure that the utilities meet the law, that they're doing everything to stay in compliance with the Efficient Use of Energy Act, and then present those results to the commission, the commissioners. Even if they're totally passionate about renewable energy or totally passionate about energy efficiency, they don't get to vote. At the end of the day, it's the 5 commissioners who vote. So it's really with them that the burden falls to understand the issues and to make sure that they're complying with the law and that they are following what they think is right for their constituents.
That's interesting.
Right.
Another question seems to me, I understand the constraints that the PRC is up against. So if a person like myself was really interested in pushing renewables and getting energy efficiency particularly to come to the fore, those efforts should be placed at the legislative level?
Well, that's my opinion. Some people disagree with me on that because they've tried with the legislature before, and you know, it's a tough go, particularly in a state like New Mexico, where the legislature, it's you know, they're citizen legislators, okay? They have jobs and careers and lives, and they have to take off, you know, 4 weeks or, you know, 6 weeks to come to Santa Fe and act as legislators before they can go back home. So our system here in this state is one year we have a short session, and the next year, alternate years, we have a long session. The law says that the short sessions are only supposed to be concerned with budget items. So if you're trying to work with the legislature to get more energy efficiency or to get more renewable energy, it means you really got to go to the long session for the most part, except for small changes. If you want to get a big change, let's say, a big philosophical change to what the law says, you've really got to start planning your strategy for the long session, which means every other year. So you've got to have at least a 2-year horizon to be thinking about changes. And typically it's going to be hard to get something brand new through the legislature on the first time out, which means now you got to be thinking about 4 years or 6 years.
Or 6 years.
You know, and you've got to get political acceptance and you've got to gain allies. You know, people like Brian Egolf and Tim Wirth are Tim Worth is one of the state senators representing Santa Fe. Brian Egolf is one of the representatives representing Santa Fe, and they're well known to be very, progressive and very much behind these kinds of efforts. But our state legislature tends to be, pretty evenly divided between, kind of the very conservative and the very progressive members. And so you've really got to work very hard with a long horizon if you want to get these kinds of changes through legislation. But I think it's really the only path. So one of the things that I know the city of Santa Fe has been trying to do, I think actually the county of Santa Fe, has been to try and get P&M to accept community solar.
Right.
So just for people who might be listening to this, community solar, which they do have in Taos.
I've seen that array. Yeah.
Right. The basic idea behind community solar is this, that you have one larger solar array in kind of a very optimal spot for solar power, and you sell individual modules to individual customers who then get the benefit of that solar power in their electric bill as though that module was installed on the top of their house.
And the advantages are, if you don't have good solar access, if you don't own a home, if you're a renter, you can have PV.
Right. It makes sense, right?
Plus you get the economy of scale
Scale.
in putting in several hundred.
It makes a lot better sense because, having hundreds of houses and homes and having thousands, tens of thousands of homes and buildings with solar on top of them is not particularly an efficient way to do it.
And I had to agree with the gentleman from P&M who made that point. He pointed out the true economics of it, $7 compared to $12
Right.
per some unit.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's a good deal more expensive to do it that way. We could drive the costs down even faster with community solar. The problem with community solar in New Mexico is that there are many, many regulatory lawyers out there who believe that it violates state law. Specifically the wheeling aspect of the state law, which says that a utility in the state of New Mexico cannot be ordered to wheel. Wheel means to basically sell someone else's power to a retail customer by wheeling their electricity through the utility's transmission and distribution lines.
So in the long run, and we're talking nationally now, as well as New Mexico, doesn't it make sense to strip the utilities of their monopoly position with respect to generation and form a separate entity that would be distribution? Is that too far-fetched? Is that too hard to pull off? Or
well, it's not too hard to pull off. It's not far-fetched because, in fact, 20-some states have already done that.
Oh, they have.
Including Texas, right next door. And in those states, we call them the deregulated states, the generation has been separated from the transmission and the distribution. Generation is a competitive industry. Basically it's not just the utilities power plants, but it's, anybody who
Yours
knows
and
how
mine.
to,
Yeah.
right. I mean, General Electric, it could be, whoever, Siemens, it could be any number. It could be wind turbines, whatever. They all sell competitively and use the wires, the transmission and distribution wires, as a common carrier.
Is that why we're
status.
seeing leasing of rooftop solar in some states and not in others? Is that one of the drivers?
Well, it certainly helps, although I think leasing faces different issues. Leasing is a little bit more complicated issue. But certainly, if the wires, the transmission and distribution wires that are owned by the utility, if those were treated as common carrier status, like our highways are treated,
Right.
for example, then it would take away a lot of the obstacles. The law to do that in New Mexico was passed in the late 1990s. So there is actually there was a law on the books to create a deregulated electric industry here in New Mexico, and the 3 investor-owned utilities were on the path to start working towards that. What happened in 2000, though, we had the California energy crisis, which, you have to go back 14 years now to remember what happened then. But California, which did have that deregulated environment, the energy prices went crazy, mainly because the energy market was being manipulated by these new competitive players. It caused bankruptcy of the largest utility in the United States, Pacific Gas and Electric. It caused people's electric bills to triple, quadruple. It caused a big political problem. And one of the repercussions of that problem was that everywhere in the western United States, the laws to deregulate were repealed, including here in New Mexico. So that law was repealed. And I don't see that there's any popular support to revive that whole issue here. They tried in Arizona earlier this year to revive the deregulation law there. It got nowhere. I think the same thing would happen here. The reason I give you that little bit of history, though, is because I don't think it would be politically smart or even feasible to try and revive deregulation law here. But what I think could happen here is that we do what Colorado did, and we just take their community solar law, which they passed last year, and we just change Colorado to New Mexico, everywhere in there, and we start working on the legislature.
So would that do an end run around this wheeling problem then?
Yes.
I see.
It would.
Because from what I understand, community solar is just very robust in Colorado.
Yeah, it is. It's gotten that way because the law cleared the path
I see.
for it. And what it does is it says, in this particular instance of community solar, and not in any other instance, but in this particular instance of community solar, it is permissible under the law. It is a permissible application of wheeling, and that works. It doesn't open the door wide for,
Rooftop solar? Or?
Well, the P&M's concern with opening the door to wheeling, their concern is that if they open it up for community solar voluntarily, let's say they just said,
okay,
yeah, we'll do it on our own. We won't wait for the legislature to pass a law. We'll allow you to do it. Their concern, and I think it's well-founded, is that if they allow, a Taos-style community solar where you put up, 100 kilowatts of photovoltaic and you start selling off the panels, what then is going to stop a big manufacturer like an Intel or a Honeywell from saying, but wait a second, we want to wheel power too. You let them do it. Okay?
We want to put in
we
100
want the
megawatts.
same thing. Right, we want to put in 100 megawatts. Oh, and by the way, we don't want it to be solar. We want it to be, a natural gas powered, and yeah, we're going to do it ourselves. Their concern is that it opens the door to kind of a free-for-all. What Colorado did was work with their utilities to close the door except for that narrow exception.
I see.
And do it in law. And I think that would have a good chance of getting through. Not first time, but maybe second or third time. So, my comment to the people who've talked to me here in Santa Fe is, what are you wasting time for? Time's a ticking. Get busy on warming up your legislators on this one, because it's going to take 2 or 3 sessions to get it done. But I think it's worth doing.
So again, you're advocating going through the legislative process, not the PRC, not the utilities. I mean,
I am advocating going through the legislative process. The PRC is a quasi-judicial body. Theoretically, it's not their job to make policy. It's their job to enforce policy and to interpret it. Now, that's got some gray edges around it because the statute leaves open some areas where the PRC can act on policy. But my view of a PRC commissioner is that they're much closer to a judge than they are to a legislator. That's what they should be. They should be looking at all the facts that are presented, put in front of them, and they should be weighing those facts and making a decision about whether this complies with the law, whether this complies with our rules that have been established to implement the law or not. When regulators start getting involved in making policy decisions that the law doesn't specifically give them, you're setting yourself up for an appeal to the Supreme Court. And in fact, this PRC, the PRC has been appealed to the Supreme Court I don't know how many times, because they do tend to wander off the rails every once in a while.
Oh, interesting.
So,
Okay. That clarifies a lot about how the PRC fits into this whole puzzle, because in that room, in that table,
right.
we had some renewable people who are probably in the camp that I'm in, I'd have to admit, and the utility people whose constraints we often question there as I can't recall her name, kind of went on to a
Right.
to a pretty strong
Right.
soliloquy or whatever you
Right.
want to call it.
Well,
But you know, accusing the utilities of dragging their feet, accusing the utilities of, and it seems that, you know, they do put impediments in the way of rooftop solar, of distributed energy in general, and that is kind of, from Randy's point of view and from my point of view, the environmental consequences never enter the formula, and yet there's benefits there that are enormous, and we're recognizing them more and more.
well, the benefits that you talk about, we were talking a short while ago about the renewable energy rule that the PRC enacted, again, after 4 go-arounds to try and get it enacted. And basically what they did on that was to say that benefits and costs that are outside of this 1 year are not going to be considered. And that takes away that whole capacity argument, we call it, the peak argument, that it helps with peak.
Okay.
And the reason it cuts that out is because even though solar helps the utility meet peak, and Gerard Ortiz would agree with that. He said, yeah, it's in our resource plan. We have so many megawatts committed to solar to meet the peak. The benefit from meeting the peak isn't going to be realized until a few years out, when they don't have to build another plant to meet peak. That's when the benefit's realized. And this rule prevents them from realizing any benefit that's more than a year out.
Oh.
So that's what the big argument was about around the rules. That could be changed by law, you know, and my suggestion to those who think that that's the wrong way for the PRC to be acting is go to your legislator, talk to them, see if you can get enough steam behind this thing built to get your legislators to come in over the PRC and say, okay, we're going to amend the Renewable Energy Act to say this, to add this piece. But I would have to say right now, it's very difficult with the PRC to get that kind of consensus, because you've got, you know, it's split along party lines, it's split along conservative versus progressive lines,
Utilities against
it's split along, yeah, those
consumers.
commissioners who might be more leaning towards a utility versus those who might be leaning more towards renewable energy. There's a dozen different splits of those 5 commissioners, which is why it makes it difficult, in my view, to come up with consensus opinion on things. It's pretty rare that you see 5 commissioners vote on something there. That brings me, though, to another issue I want to go back to with you, and that is, are the utilities dragging their heels? And I think the answer is to that one is the utilities comply with the law, but they're not exactly speedy on these things. And I do think that there's some issues and some instances where they have been heel dragging.
Well, aren't they behind right now on the benchmarks that they're supposed to meet on their path? I thought I heard you say that they were in full compliance with the 20% thing, and
P&M is in compliance.
But
The other two are having difficulty.
But at this time, are they on the trajectory they were supposed to be on at this point, or were those not even plotted on a graph?
No, they are plotted on a graph. They're supposed to be at 15% by 2050. Sorry, 2015, and then to 20% by 2020. And my understanding is that P&M is on the trajectory. The other two, I think, certainly El Paso is saying they're not going to make it because of that RCT issue. And I'm not quite sure where Southwestern Public Service is on their trajectory. So, you know, just talking about P&M, they appear to be complying with the law. You know, I've heard and I've seen some instances where it seems like the utilities, I'm not going to name one specifically, but where the utilities have maybe taken too long to do a study, and you know, and it drags things out, and you know, when these projects get dragged out for a very long time, the economics behind them changes, and that can be damaging to the project. It's interesting to note that the California Public Utility Commission recently, just this past week, really came down hard on their 3 investor-owned utilities for doing that, for dragging their heels, for charging all sorts of interconnection costs which seem to be inflated, and really brought a hammer down on them. I think utilities all over the United States, including in New Mexico, should look at what the California Public Utilities said about that and make sure they're not going down the same path.
When it comes to numbers, P&M Gerard was quite adamant about, we've got 70 megawatts of PV, we've got 200 megawatts of wind, we've got 30-some megawatts of distributed rooftop. Never does that get put in the same sentence as what their total generating capacity is. Right. So that you could say, oh, we got 70. 70 compared to what? And do you have a handle on what that number is? Did he say 2,000? That doesn't sound right, because that comes, was it 10,000 megawatts of their generating?
Their total generating capacity is somewhere around 2,000 to 2,500 megawatts. And I forget the exact number. The total load in New Mexico is just over 3,000 megawatts, and that's all of the 25 suppliers who supply the state. P&M is by far the largest of them all. But P&M, and I mean no offense to anybody from P&M when I say this, on a national scale, they are a small utility. And so when they look at 20% of meeting 20% of their load by 2020, they're looking at somewhere between 400 and 500 megawatts, probably, of total, you know, of total renewable energy. Maybe it's a little bit more than that, but it's not much more than that if it is. And so, you know, their perspective is 70 is a big number out of 300 or 400, and 100 megawatts wind farm is a big piece of that 400 or 500 that we have to supply. They have to, Gerard kind of alluded to this, I think, in his comments. For them to put together a plan, a renewable energy plan, that's going to stay under that 3% cost cap that I talked about,
yes,
and that's going to keep everybody in the state happy, is, you know, very difficult, and that's an understatement. You know, you have parties like the Attorney General's office and the New Mexico Industrial Energy Coalition that want that cost to be as low as possible. So they would prefer to see the whole 20% be wind. All right, they would, quite candidly, they would probably prefer to see solar just run out of town on that one. Well, you know, the rules don't allow that. The rules say, you know, so much has to be solar, so much has to be wind.
And at one time you intervened, the Public Regulatory Commission intervened to make sure that that was so. Isn't that correct? Didn't they come one time to repeal the solar, the PV component of it.
Right. That was one of these four go-arounds in the past
Okay.
16 months, was to kind of get rid of all of that, which would have had a pretty devastating impact on the solar energy industry in the state. My point then was solar is coming down very fast. $50 a megawatt hour right now is the going price for utility scale solar. That's competitive with brand new natural gas. It's not competitive, as Gerard said in our conversation, it's not competitive with existing natural gas and existing coal plants.
Okay.
But for a new coal plant, for a brand new natural gas fired plant, $50 is a competitive price. Now, those who don't like solar power will say, well, yeah, but that 50 has a federal investment, federal ITC, investment tax credit, buried into it. They're right, it does. But I don't know of any particular source of power that doesn't have some sort of subsidies
Sure.
in it, one way or the other. And perhaps the biggest one is in nuclear power.
Absolutely.
The
Where we take, as citizens, take on all the risk of that industry.
We take on all of the risks of that industry. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not an anti-nuclear person, okay? It seems to me that if we have a goal of getting to a carbon-free environment in this century, nuclear's got to play a piece of that. That's just my opinion, and I know a lot of people disagree with me about that.
I'm not one,
But
I agree with you on that issue.
But that doesn't do away with the fact that the federal government subsidizes nuclear power
Heavily.
plants pretty heavily. So, there is no level playing field. There has never been a level playing field among the various forms of energy production. And to think that politically we're going to suddenly snap our fingers and everything's going to be put on a level playing field today, no, it's not going to happen, So
Interesting.
that's where we are with it.
It's where we are. It was very instructive to listen to the viewpoints earlier, and it's been extremely educational to speak directly to you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity, and as far as the Solar Fiesta is concerned, I think it's been a great success so far, and I congratulate NMSEA for its efforts to put on these kinds of things to help everybody learn more about renewable energy.
Yes, and Santa Fe Community College certainly played a big role in this particular event too, and have to be acknowledged as well. So it's really a nice bringing together to try and educate ourselves on this. And as Randy pointed out, the educational level on energy, and particularly energy efficiency, is just nowhere in this country, and it really needs
Right.
to be brought up.
It does. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Nice talking to you.